religious or spiritual theme, even when it was not written for religious purposes. He wrote INJ on many of his compositions, the Latin abbreviation for "in the name of Jesus," even when those works were non-religious. To Bach, music was a form of worship. Bach remained at this post for the rest of his life, and it's here that he wrote many of his masterpieces. He also continued performing and impressing audiences with his virtuoso organ playing. In his life, Bach played for worshipers, for his family, for students, for other professional musicians, for princes, and for dukes and for kings. In 1747, he was invited to play before Frederick the Great of Prussia at Potsdam. By now, Bach's reputation as a teacher was well established, and students flocked to him from all over the country. He was said to be a very patient teacher who achieved remarkable results. During his years at Leipzig, Bach was also given several non-musical duties that he deeply resented. Because of this, he began to take absences without leave, going off to play the organ here and there, and taking his sons to the Dresden Opera to hear what he called the pretty tunes. He probably accepted many playing engagements for the money, since he had complained that his income by now was less than he had hoped it would be. With a full house of little Bachs, this was an understandable concern. As usual, friction developed between Bach and his employers, because of his declining interest and for other reasons too. Bach was annoyed that they were admitting boys into the school who lacked musical talent, and he was therefore unable to maintain the quality of the chorus. They also refused to adequately finance the orchestra. Finally, Bach convinced a prominent citizen to intervene and obtain a settlement. No one knows what that settlement was, but from then on, Bach seemed content and able to do what he pleased. When Bach approached the age of 55, he began to have trouble with his eyes, probably aggravated by many years of composing late at night by dim light. At first it seemed to him just as if the light was too low or the ink too weak, but the troubles grew progressively worse until he had to seek medical help. There were 2 operations performed, but neither were successful. It's sometimes believed that these operations, completed without benefit of anesthesia, may have weakened Bach. He had a series of illnesses afterwards and finally died of a stroke in 1750. At the time of his death, he was 65 years old, and he was completely blind. Anna Magdalena survived Bach by 10 years, but she was in difficult financial straits. It's not known why she received no help from her children or stepchildren, but it is known that when she died, she was given a pauper's funeral. The amount of music Bach produced in his 65 years is phenomenal. Years later, a great fan of Bach's, Ludwig van Beethoven, would complain that Bach had not been well named. He said he should have been named Meer, which means ocean, rather than Bach, which means brook. For, said Beethoven, no one ever accomplished such an enormous amount of work. Because of his many duties, Bach was required to write music of all different kinds: organ and choral music for the church, chamber music for the court, and harpsichord music for teaching his students and children. Besides these many and varied duties, he found the time to explore his own musical interests in personal compositions, most of which were not performed in his lifetime. Yet it's these private experiments and expressions that now rank among the greatest of the Baroque period. At the beginning of his career, Bach's work drew on the foundations laid by previous Baroque composers, but he soon developed his own distinctive style. It included a greater use of counterpoint, a sense of passion, and a masterful sense of structure. In the last years of his life, his work grew progressively more complex. A large body of his work is the cantatas, of which he wrote more than 200. A cantata is a long, usually religious work for chorus and orchestra. Bach's cantatas were often written around allegorical or mythological themes. Many of his cantatas, and some of his finest organ work, was written in the period he was at Weimar, working under the patronage of the Duke. 2 famous pieces from that period are Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Bach also wrote spectacular passion settings. In music, a passion is a representation of Christ's suffering or crucifixion. Bach wrote 5 passions, but only 2 survived: the Passion according to St. John and the Passion according to St. Matthew. Both demonstrate his great ability to tell a dramatic story without benefit of stage or settings. His other famous sacred works are the Easter and Christmas oratorios and the Mass in B minor. An oratorio is a large musical composition for solo voices, chorus, and orchestra, and it usually dramatizes a sacred story. A Mass is exactly what it sounds like. It's part of the church Mass or liturgy set to music. One of Bach's most beloved pieces is the Mass in B minor. Not all of Bach's music was specifically religious. In other non-religious music, Bach's love for the keyboard rose to the surface. There are many organ and harpsichord works that range from the very simple to the most complex. The two most famous of these are the Well-Tempered Clavier, which was written in 2 sections, 22 years apart. Each section has 24 preludes and fugues, written in each of the 12 major and minor keys. The other famous keyboard piece is his Goldberg Variations. The latter were written for an insomniac count who wanted music that would help him sleep. The insomniac count, apparently cured, later sent Bach the largest payment he ever received. There were many instruments that inspired Bach. He wrote special pieces for the cello, violin, lute, viola, flute, harpsichord, and oboe. For chamber orchestra, he wrote the well-known Brandenburg Concertos and 4 extended suites. The Brandenburg Concertos were written and performed in hopes they would land him a position with a court official in Brandenburg. The Brandenburg Concertos did not land Bach the job he was after, but today they're among the most famous instrumental works of the entire Baroque period. In his own time, people found Bach's work too elaborate and preferred music that was simpler and livelier. Although he was appreciated as an organist, the grandness of his compositions would not be realized until the next century, when the composer Felix Mendelssohn revived Bach's Passion according to St. Matthew. Bach's complete works fill 60 volumes, and yet only 9 or 10 were published while he was still alive. Besides working in almost all the musical genres of his time, Bach also blended the different national styles of the 1700s, including French, Italian, English, and German. His music combined an intellectual mastery with exquisite melodies, and although his music can be ornate, it's never showy and strives instead for deeper meaning. Today, Bach's music is still widely performed, and there's a growing interest in performing it the way it was done in his own time. That means the use of small ensembles rather than large choral ensembles, and the use of instruments that are constructed just as they were in the 1700s. There are special Bach festivals held in Europe annually, and concerts of his work still draw large, enthusiastic crowds. It's possible that someday he may even have fans on other planets. When the spaceship Voyager was launched into space in 1977, it carried several items that represented the best and most beautiful of what Earth had to offer. There were copies of our greatest works of art, colorful pictures of people from around the world, the haunting calls of whales in the sea, minerals and gemstones, and photographs of our mountains and forests. There were also recordings of the music of some of our greatest composers, including 3 selections from Johann Sebastian Bach. For 50 years after he died, Bach's music was completely ignored. By then, people were more interested in the new composers, Haydn and Mozart, who, along with Beethoven, had been heavily influenced by Bach, but had created an entirely new sound to classical music. With all this fresh innovation taking place, it was difficult for people to summon interest in a composer who was considered old-fashioned even in his own lifetime. Now, 300 years later, we can appreciate that, far from reverting to an old familiar style, Bach took that style and brought it to its perfection. To Johann Sebastian Bach, music was a form of worship. It offered a very practical way, as a Christian, to serve his fellow man. Through his compositions and his playing, he was able to serve the church and its worshippers, the public, the city, and his patron. He also wrote music to serve his children and his students. He adapted his style and technique to whatever the given need. Bach didn't think in terms of fame or posterity. He saw himself instead as a professional, a craftsman making a living by serving his community's needs for beauty. The result was a large body of work that seems to offer something for everyone: delight to the casual listener, instruction to the professional musician, and inspiration to the devout. He was in many ways a true Christian, pious, tender and big-hearted, and modest. He once said, "I have had to work hard. Anyone who works just as hard will get just as far." He may be right, but in all the history of music, no one has quite yet produced so much nor gotten as far as Johann Sebastian Bach.
This is the end of the session.